Hello friends, my name is Raven, I use they, she pronouns, and welcome back for the second video of this Dice Throne Hero series where we're looking at each playable hero in the Dice Throne universe game series, which means that we are now on to talking about the Moon Elf. And as before, we're going to be looking at first doing a bit of an overview of what the Moon Elf is about, what they do, looking at her leaflet, looking at her board, looking at her cards, and talking a little bit about how she plays, what she's good at, what she's not so good at. So yeah, let's get right into it and have a look at the Moon Elf.
All right, this is the Moon Elf. She is a complexity 2 hero and was the one that was in the 1v1 box with the Barbarian and often used alongside the Barbarian to help teach people how to originally play Dice Throne. So we've got a few more status effect abilities over here, and as we'll see, that's a big part of how she plays, is inflicting these different status effects on people and also on herself. But a big part is also avoiding damage entirely, rather than healing from damage like the Barbarian did. So let's come over here and have a look at her leaflet. So similar to the Barbarian, we have 3 symbols. So on a 1, 2, 3, we have an arrow. On a 4 and 5, we have a foot. And on a 6, we have a moon. And here we have 4 status effects, 3 negative and 1 positive. So first we have blind, which has a stack limit of 1. And next time a player that has this token finishes their offensive roll phase, they remove it. They roll a dice. On a 1 or a 2, their offensive roll phase fails and has no effect of any kind. So it means that it cancels their entire attack or ability or whatever it was that they were going to activate. They deal no damage, they inflict no status effects, they don't gain any benefits from it whatsoever. So 1 in 3 chance that their offensive roll phase just is completely nixed, which is quite strong. Though, of course, it's only a 1 in 3 chance, so 2/3 of the time it does do nothing, which is worth noting. Then we have Entangle. Also has a stack limit of 1, also a negative status effect. When someone has this token, they will get 1 fewer roll attempt during their next offensive roll phase, but it's only a once off. They remove it at the end of that roll phase. So you usually have 3 roll attempts, but if you have an Entangle, you would instead have 2 roll attempts. Then we have Evasive, which is kind of the key status effect for the Moon Elf, really. Now, this is a positive status effect with a stack limit of 3. So when a player with this token receives damage, or would receive damage perhaps, they may choose to spend this token. If they do, they roll a dice. If the outcome is a 1 or a 2, they take no damage at all. Although, as it says, other associated effects may still apply, such as if someone was giving you tokens, status effects themselves, or something like that, that would still happen. And it also reminds you that multiple tokens may be spent in an attempt to prevent the same source of damage. And it's also worth noting that this does not say when a player with this token would be attacked. It says when a player with this token receives damage. So regardless of where that damage comes from, what is dealing damage to you, you can use an evasive token to try and avoid that damage, which is quite powerful, particularly when it's avoiding all of the damage. Then our final one that we have here is targeted, another negative status effect with a stack limit of 1. If someone has this token, anytime that they are being attacked by an opponent, the incoming attack damage is increased by 2, and this one sticks around. It is persistent. It doesn't go away. And that can be quite strong if you can get it on someone early in the game. All right, so we've got a bit of an idea of what the Moon Elf is doing with these status effect tokens. A little bit more complex than the Barbarian, with complexity 2 instead of 1. So let's have a look here at the different abilities that we have. So as with most heroes, we've got our basic ability over here. We've kind of got a full house sort of thing happening here, and then a similar sort of thing, so full house with the foot, and then full house with the moon and arrows, and then small straight, large straight, sixes, and defense. So let's start over here with basic ability. We've got longbow, 3 symbols deals 4, 4 symbols deals 5, and 5 arrows does 7. So a little bit of a jump there on the 5, which is nice, but fairly small amount of damage, and most of the time you're probably not wanting to activate this if you can avoid it. Upgrade for 2 combat points changes it from 457 to 468, and on 4 of a kind of numbers you inflict entangle. And then the level 3 upgrade, which costs you 3 combat points, jumps it up, each of those up 1 damage, so 468 to 579, and instead it's now only on 3 of a kind that you inflict entangle. And that's still on the lower end of damage, but like being able to do 7 damage, being able to do 9 damage is a decent amount. But you've also now invested 3 combat points now into this basic ability, which is probably more than you want to be doing, but it depends on the cards you draw, as always. Next up, we have Demising Shot. So 3 arrows, 2 moons, so 2 sixes that you need to do here to inflict targeted and then deal 4 damage. And of course, because you're inflicting targeted first, that 4 damage does indeed become 6 damage immediately. If you can manage to get this one off early, that can be quite strong. And this ability can also be upgraded to, instead of dealing 4 damage, deal 6 damage, which then becomes 8, of course. And you get an additional ability here, Focus, where you just inflict targeted and entangle on a chosen opponent. Now, because you're not dealing any damage, that does mean that this isn't an attack. But even just being able to get targeted on someone is still quite strong. Ideally, you want to be doing damage as well, of course, but having that as a backup is still quite nice. This is a fairly strong ability. Now, of course, keep in mind you can only inflict targeted on someone once. If they already have targeted, you probably want to be doing something else, like maybe this covered shot over here. With 2 arrows and 3 feet, you gain evasive and deal 7 damage. As I mentioned before, evasive is kind of one of the key things that the Moon Elf really wants to be doing, avoiding that damage completely. And when you upgrade the covered shot, you are dealing 2 more damage up to 9. And then you also have this option of evasive action. Just 3 feet, a chosen player gains evasive, and you deal 2 undefendable damage. Now, that line of text is really only relevant if you're playing with more than 2 players, if you're perhaps doing a 2v2 game, or perhaps if you're playing something like Dice Throne Adventures or Dice Throne Missions, where you're in a cooperative environment, and so you can give evasive to one of your teammates. But in 1v1 format, which is mostly what's happening, being able to have the option to just get an evasive and deal 2 undefendable damage, particularly if you have already inflicted a targeted on the opponent and that becomes 4 undefendable damage, is still quite nice as an option to have available to you. And 2 combat points for that upgrade is quite reasonable. Next, we have Exploding Arrow, which is 1 arrow and 3 6s. So multiple of our abilities here needing more than 1 6. You roll 5 dice, and the different things happen depending on what you roll. So you deal 3 damage regardless, and then you add a damage for each arrow you roll, and you add a damage for each foot you roll. And additionally, the opponent loses 1 combat point for each moon that you roll, and you also inflict blind. So you've got a few different possibilities here in terms of how this can play out. It could be as much as 8 damage and inflicting blind. It could be as low as 3 damage, but the opponent loses 5 combat points and you inflict blind. So you're always dealing at least 3 damage, you're always inflicting blind, and then it's just a case of how much extra damage you're doing or how many combat points the opponent is losing. Keep in mind, of course, they can't go below 0. And you're not stealing those combat points, they're just losing them. And you can actually upgrade this ability twice. So on our first upgrade, you deal an additional damage for each foot you roll. So foot now does 2 damage instead of 1. So our maximum here, instead of being 8 damage, would now be 13 damage if we rolled all feet. And we have an additional upgrade, Exploding Arrow 3, where the only difference here is you also inflict Entangle, which is honestly a relatively small upgrade. Entangle is nice, but isn't as strong as many of the other abilities that the Moon Elf has. So I feel like often you won't be playing the level 3 upgrade if you already have the level 2, unless you've just got combat points to burn or don't really have much else to do a lot of the time. Next up, we have the Small Straight ability, where you inflict Entangle, then deal 7 damage. 7 damage is quite nice. Inflict Entangle, even though it's not as strong as some of the other abilities, is still handy. Being able to restrict what your opponent is doing and what they're able to activate is handy. And the upgrade for this, you are dealing 9 damage instead of 7, which is quite strong. Is quite strong there. And then we have our Large Straight, where you inflict blind, gain evasive, and deal 8 damage. So that's the evasive again there. So we now have 2 abilities that give us evasive, and also another one that inflicts blind. And then with our upgrade, you instead deal 10 damage and still inflict blind and gain evasive. So that's fairly strong. And then we have access to a new ability, Lunar Blessing, which is 1 arrow, 2 feet, and 1 moon, where you gain 3 evasive and inflict Entangle. So you're going up to the stack limit for evasive and inflicting Entangle, but you aren't dealing any damage. So it's nice to have as a backup if you're going for one of these straights but don't quite get there. This will probably be where you end up a lot of the time with this kind of mishmash of symbols, because for both each of these other abilities, you're only wanting 2 of the symbols. Having 3 different symbols really doesn't help you unless you're going for straights. But if you're going for straights, then you need that 1 2 3 4, 2 3 4 5 sort of thing happening. And so if you don't have that, then Lunar Blessing can be a good option. And having 3 evasive is quite strong, even if you're not able to deal any damage with that ability. Then we have our 6s, and the Moon Elf 6 is, I think, possibly unique amongst all of the 6 abilities. So 4 6s, you inflict blind, entangle, and targeted, and then you deal 7 damage. But it's not undefendable. I might be wrong here, and I guess we'll see as we go, but I think all other characters, their 4 6s ability does undefendable damage, but Moon Elf does not. So that is worth noting that she does not deal undefendable damage with any of her abilities. And even if you upgrade the 4/6s, it still doesn't become undefendable damage. You deal 9 damage instead of 7, which is nice. And you're still inflicting, blind, entangle, and targeted. So, like, if you didn't have targeted on before, you'd be dealing 9 instead of 7, and here you'd be dealing 11 instead of 9. And then you have Moon Shadow as the 3/6s possibility, where you just get all of the statuses, right? You gain evasive, and then you inflict blind, entangle, and targeted. I like the Moon Shadow reference there to the Cat Stevens song. It's very nice. And then we have the defense roll, Missed Me, where you roll all 5 of your dice. So already starting off with 5 dice for a defense roll, which is quite good. And then on 2 feet, you prevent half the damage rounded up that is coming at you. And for every pair of arrows, you deal 1 damage. Now, it's worth noting this specifically says on, not times, whereas this says for every pair. This is just on a pair. So even if you get 4 feet, you're still only preventing half the damage here. So that's important to note. That's a common mistake that people can make with the wording of some of these abilities. And with the upgrade here, which costs 3 combat points, you're still just on 2 feet, prevent half damage, but instead of every pair of arrows you deal 1, it's for every arrow you are dealing 1. Dealing 1 for every arrow that you roll. And this preventing half damage for 2 feet is really kind of a key part of the Moon Elf's ability suite, as it were, here. So preventing that damage with the double foot there is really what you want to be rolling pretty much every time if you can with that defense roll. So that is quite a strong ability to be able to have there on the defense, preventing half the damage rounded up. And I guess it is worth noting in terms of how half damage works with different damage adders and things like that. For example, if there was 4 damage coming at you originally and then you prevent half the damage, but then someone adds 3 more damage, all of the damage is added up together before the prevent half would happen. The damage is halved. So in that instance, you'd go, okay, there was originally 4 damage, you add the 3 damage, that becomes 7, and then you're preventing half rounded up. So you prevent 3.5 becomes 4 damage. So you've prevented 4, so you're only taking 3. It's a little bit complex, but feel free to look at some of the FAQ. There's always a FAQ on the reverse side of these leaflets if you're not sure about the kind of corner cases for some of how things work, or the order of operations for things. We nearly forgot, but Moon Elf also has an ultimate ability, which is important. So 5/6s, you gain evasive, inflict blind, entangle, and targeted, then deal 12 undefendable damage. So doing all the status effects similar to that Moon Shadow ability, which we had with the 3/6s, and then 12 undefendable damage, which is, of course, quite strong. But that's the Moon Elf's board. So we got a pretty good handle on what's happening here. We looked at all of her upgrades. So let's look at her unique cards. So we've got her, for main phase cards, we have a promo card. So on a 6, you inflict blind, entangle, and targeted on a chosen opponent. On any other outcome, draw a card. So that's very similar to what you're doing with, say, this focus ability or part of the eclipse ability or that Moon Shadow, but you're not getting evasive, but you're inflicting all the negative status effects. So it's quite nice if you're able to get it, but you're happy just to draw the card as well, because you don't have other ways to be able to do that. Then we have Moon Magic, which costs you 4 combat points and is almost doing exactly the same as what this is doing, but it's doing the full Moon Shadow ability, actually. So gain evasive, inflict blind, entangle, and targeted on a chosen opponent. It does cost you 4 combat points, which is a lot. It is a lot of combat points, and you don't have additional ways to gain those combat points. So a lot of the time, I feel like Moon Magic is a little bit too expensive, even though it is quite a fairly strong ability. It is very expensive, and so a lot of the time, I feel like you aren't quite able to get to that full amount of combat points, particularly if you're wanting to put some of these upgrades out. Then we have the roll phase cards that she has, and she has 2 different attack modifiers. One is Volley, which costs you 1 combat point. You roll 5 dice, you add 1 damage for each arrow you roll, and you also inflict Entangle. So you're always inflicting Entangle, and then you can deal up to an extra 5 damage just for 1 combat point, which is quite nice. And then you have Take That, which doesn't cost you anything. It's a free card. You roll 1 dice. On an arrow, you add 2 damage. On a foot, you inflict Entangle. And on a moon, you inflict Blind. This is quite nice to have as an option there. Just a free value add to your attack is quite helpful and handy. And then finally, for our instant action card, we have Evade. It only costs us 1 combat point, and it says a chosen player gains evasive. Having this here as an option, just instantly gaining an evasive, is just very helpful, is very handy to have in your arsenal as an option to be able to have that possibility, at least, of preventing damage. So that gives us a pretty solid look at the Moon Elf, at her leaflet, her board, her cards, and the sorts of things that she is doing.
All right, so that was the Moon Elf. We had a good solid look at how she works. So as you can see, she's not quite dealing the same amount of damage that the Barbarian might be most of the time, but instead she's dodging a lot of damage that's coming at her, and a lot of the time when attacks come at you, you might be able to halve that damage or take no damage at all, which is very strong. She also has a lot more options in terms of being able to interact with the opponent with that blind, with that targeted, with that entangle. So there's a lot more ways to kind of restrict what the opponent is doing, or manipulate that a little bit, kind of reduce the amount of damage that they're going to be doing back to you, or reduce the effectiveness of what they're doing. And so that's a lot of what she is good at. Though again, similar to the Barbarian, she doesn't have any ways to be drawing extra cards or ways to be gaining extra combat points outside of the standard card set that you have available with every hero. So again, if those are things that you enjoy doing a lot more of, perhaps the Moon Elf or the Barbarian aren't heroes that are for you. But if you enjoy, being able to prevent a lot of damage, and being able to interact a bit more with the opponent, she can be a good option. It's also worth noting that she doesn't have those ways to do undefendable damage, so that is outside of her ultimate ability, of course. So that is also a thing to keep in mind. She doesn't have as many ways to be able to break that damage through that she is dealing. So that can be a difficulty with her as well. But yeah, what do you think? Let me know in the comments section down below. Have you played with the Moon Elf before? How have you found her? What matchups have you done with the Moon Elf? What is she good against? What is she bad against? Do you enjoy playing with her? Let me know in the comment section down below, and I will see you next time for the Pyro.